Welcome everyone to what will be a very special gathering this evening to celebrate the launch of a prize-winning novella by Deborah Tomkins, Green Christian trustee and former co-chair for 5 years, up to July last year. We all know and love Deborah for her huge contribution to Green Christian, amongst which has been her wonderfully vital creative work, authoring the Deep Waters Eco-Anxiety Programme, soon to be rolled out later this year for the 11th time. And this evening we particularly welcome Neil Griffiths of Weatherglass Books, who published Aerth, Deborah's novella. That's the one. And just to explain the programme for this evening, the bulk of it will be essentially a conversation between Neil and Deborah about the book for about half an hour, and then we'll open it up for questions. And if you think of a question before then, you can put it in the chat and we'll ensure that it's picked up. But first, we'll start with a short prayer. Creator God, thank you for the opportunity for us all to be here this evening. We know how much you love creativity as an expression of the many gifts we have been granted by simply being alive and open to what is going on around us and within us. We in Green Christian attempt to reflect that expression in many ways, amongst them valuing prayer, poetry, visual arts and literature. May this evening be a testament to that, and may we all be touched by what we hear and see. And we ask this in the name of Christ. Amen. I'm going to hand over now to Deborah and Neil.
Okay, right. Thank you, George. I'm one of the co-founders of Weatherglass Books. And the beginning of the year before last, we started a novella competition to be judged by the multi-award-winning Ali Smith. And she decided on 2 winners. One was by a Tasmanian writer, Kate Cromink, called Astraea, and Deborah Tomkins. Well, it wasn't called Aerth at the time. It was called First Do No Harm. But there were a number of books called First Do No Harm already, so we renamed it. Just a quick word on the novella. In which way it's different from a novel. Well, it's shorter, for one. We had a maximum of 40,000 words. But I also think that we feel that the novella is a form for our times, that the world is too complex for the kind of state of the nation novel, which essentially was a kind of 19th century invention. And actually forcing people to have the constraints to focus on one thing means that they can find the kind of richness in actually a very narrow scene. What's interesting about our 2 winners is that Astraea, which is set on a 19th century female convict ship, the action pretty much takes place on a small boat over 36 hours. Deborah's novella, in comparison, is set on 3 planets and takes set over about 40 years. And I think that speaks to not only the imaginative scope of Deborah's novel, but also what one can do in actually, I think it's 32,000 words. Every single creative and scene of this novel is completely novella, is completely richly explicated. There is no loss because of lack of length, and we're absolutely thrilled to publish it. It came out It was launched the published date about 10 days ago. We've already sold out our first print run and have to reprint. And it's also had an absolute rave review in the Daily Telegraph, a glowing review in the Guardian, and we're awaiting a review in the Financial Times. So it's really beginning to find its place in the world. So before Deborah and I chat, Deborah's going to, we're going to bookend the chat with reading. So Deborah's going to read for a little bit before we chat, then she's going to read for a little bit after we chat. And then there's going to be some questions if you have any. And just before, in case I forget at the end of it, if you'd like a signed copy, if you go to the Weatherglass website and order a copy there, it is discounted by £1 for the next 2 hours. And also I will then send the copies to Deborah. She will sign them and then send them on to you. I'll try and remember that after our chat, but if I haven't, I've said it now. It's just if you just Google Weatherglass, it'll be there. Okay, Deborah, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, George, for your welcome, and thank you, Neil, for yours as well, and introduction to the novella form. I'm going to read right from the very beginning. The novella is actually it's divided into 4 sections, which are really chapters, and then each chapter has tiny sections in it, or very short sections in it. Some are shorter than others, and this is because of the flash form, and I'll explain that a little bit later. So this very first section is called Now We Are 7. I'm not able to read right to the end of this section because it's a bit too long, but it'll give you the beginning of the book. Now We Are 7. Had Magnus of Arden stayed home, enjoyed his party, blown out the 7 candles on his cake, he would not now be sitting at the top of an oak tree, quietly observing like an explorer. Through gaps in the bright early summer leaves, Magnus can see the farmhouse a quarter mile away, and beyond it, the once wide elm-lined high road, the machine dump, forbidden to all but a few, and the turf roofs of the village, solar panels gleaming scarlet in the setting sun. Surrounding all looms the wildwood, dense, dark, almost impenetrable. Here bears and wolves and lynxes prowl, and elk and moose roam the narrow paths which were at one time thoroughfares for humans, but are now entangled with brambles, ivy, and straggling twisted shrubs. When he's older, he and Ryan will explore some of the abandoned villages, visit the old machines in the dump, if their mothers will let them. People have gathered in 2s and 3s, milling about the garden and orchard, sipping from mugs of tea, glasses of cider. They arrive in pony carts, on bicycles, by foot. Voices carry far on this windless evening. Magnus is hoping that the uncle who made his last birthday so exciting will appear. This man, somehow more vibrant and alive than anyone Magnus ever met before, had driven up on a motorcycle, laughing at people's surprise. People stood back in a semicircle as he parked his vehicle, held their children's hands. Only Magnus was allowed to sit on the gleaming machine, his legs dangling, his fingers barely reaching the handlebars. His mother stood beside him, arms folded, her smile cautious, her brows drawn together. Then she shrugged, said, "Behave yourself." Today, Magnus understands that she meant her brother, not her son, judging from her grumpy comments this morning. Revisionist, conspiracist, dangerous. The world's moved on. And that machine, he'll kill himself on it one day. Last year, his uncle's laugh was so infectious that even Magnus's mother smiled and seemed happy, until he placed Magnus on the back of his machine and rode him on the bumpy track down to the weir. Then he was banished, her anger so fierce and uncompromising that nobody could calm her. Magnus is not to mention that man's name again, even though the dogs liked him, and dogs, they say, always know. So I'll leave that one there. That's a kind of natural break.
Wonderful, thank you. In many ways, it's one of the most wonderful openings to any book, I think, and it's a very pastoral opening for what is not a particularly pastoral novel in the end. And I suppose the question I want to start with is, because there are so many different elements to the novel, what came to you first? Was it the idea? Was it Magnus? Was it the climate challenge? Was it the two-world?
Yeah, it's all, Neil, it's all tangled up in lots of different things. And it's quite difficult to tease it out. But I can tell you the very beginning of it was Magnus. It was a picture of a young man, not a boy, as the boy is 7 when it starts. A young man in his 20s. He's in an astronaut suit, and he's on another planet, Mars, as it turns out. And he's got pockets on the outside of his suit, and he keeps things in these pockets. And that was because I was actually at a flash fiction festival in Bristol in 2018. And I was in a workshop, and for whatever the prompt was, I've completely forgotten now. I wrote this little tiny story in the form of a list, actually. And then I took it home at the end of it and thought, well, what is that about? What is going on with this young man with his things in his pockets as an astronaut? I just thought it was a bit of a slightly surreal image, but it wouldn't leave me. And then because of my interest and my care for creation and my passion for the earth, he began to grow in my mind. And then I decided he came from, a rather beautiful planet, and then it actually has its own issues. And then it grew and grew and grew, but it took several years. It wasn't all written at once. I started it in 2018. And the other part of the kind of genesis of this is that the Flash Fiction Festival every year has a competition for a flash novella, a novella in flash, which means that the novella is much shorter than ours, much shorter than this novella. The upper limit is only 18,000 words, which is very short. And the challenge is to write a full story with tiny, tiny stories within it, embedded within it. And these stories can be in many, many different forms. So I thought, well, I'll have a go. So I entered it and I got longlisted. Now, the story it's in comparison with what we have today, was very sparse and thin and much shorter, obviously about half the length, just over half the length. But it wouldn't, again, the story wouldn't leave me, and the ideas in it wouldn't leave me. So I just kept going and kept fiddling around with it for several more years.
Can we do you want to say a little bit about Flash as a form?
Yeah.
Because not everybody's aware of it, and I mean, as you probably pointed out, you had a subtitle, not a subtitle, but when you sent it, is a novella in Flash.
Yes.
And we removed that because actually, in a sense, some people wouldn't necessarily know what it means, and I'm not sure that it necessarily kind of knowing about it adds to the experience, because I think the reading experience is what it is. But in terms of talking about the kind of genesis part of flash fiction, how would you describe flash fiction in a couple of sentences?
Absolutely. And actually, about calling it novella in flash, when I sent it in to you, I just didn't remove it.
Right.
It's like I thought, oh well, nobody's going to be interested in this. I'll just send it off.
Right.
So I hadn't edited it at all. I just sent it as it was. Um, Flash fiction is, they have to be very, so it has to be under 1,000 words. Sometimes it's under 500, sometimes it's under 300 words. So very, very short stories, half a page, a paragraph sometimes. But they have to be complete in some way. There has to be a beginning, middle, and end, but not necessarily chronological. And you can tell a story in all sorts of forms. You can tell it in a list. You can tell it backwards. You can tell it in the form of an email exchange or a telephone exchange or a newspaper article or any number of ways. And it will be rich and deep. If it's done well, it'll be rich and deep. I wouldn't say I'm an expert at flash fiction. When I go to the festival, I go to learn from other people who really are excellent at what they do. And they spend most of their time writing flash fiction. I am by nature and inclination a novelist, which is why this book spans 40 years. I think I like the big canvas.
Okay, thank you. I mean, in terms of the big canvas, I mean, and what I should say is, you know, for me, and I think for most people who read novels, you read them for the reading experience essentially has to be an emotional one. However, novels have themes, novels pose questions, and in this, and given the audience we have tonight, we should maybe just spend some time on how it looks at the climate challenge, if indeed it does look at the climate challenge, but it looks at the climate catastrophe. And I wonder whether you think it's a book of hope rather than resignation, because it doesn't make any grand statements about, you know, what we should do, what we ought to do, what will happen if we don't do these things. Where do you think the book is? The beginning, middle, and end of the book.
The beginning, middle, and end. Well, there are all sorts of environmental challenges to the people in this book and to nature itself. Ali Smith says this novella deals with dystopia and hope in a way that reveals them as profoundly related. And I'm very pleased she said that, actually, because I run a group. Well, I used to run a group. I think we're going to revive it this year. A group called Bristol Climate Writers. It got hit by COVID, like lots of things do. And we had a workshop, or we had an event a number of years ago where we talked about dystopia and utopias, and how in dystopia there are always the seeds of a utopia, and vice versa. In utopia, there can be the seeds of a dystopia. That we human beings aren't very good at teasing these things out, I think. So where is the book? I think the book is trying to be an observer of what's going on in several places and several planets. And it also, I believe, and I think the book also believes, that actually hope, where it exists because of the relationships between people. And one of the things I was interested in when writing it was it became apparent I was interested in, I didn't know that at the beginning, was that what does a society do when it does away with the concept of the divine, the concept of God, the concept of spirituality? What does it replace that with? One planet has one answer, and the other planet does something completely different. And it impacts people's behavior, their relationships, and the relationship with the natural world.
Can you speak a bit more about that, actually? Because if I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking that there is in Earth, the pastoral planet, that it has an approaching ice age. Theirs is a culture of deep ethics, seemed to me.
Mm.
Whereas the other Earth, which is, let's say, more similar to ours, but certainly not ours, the planet's heating up, but it's also in a much worse state, and it's almost as though there are no longer any ethics. I mean, is that part of? I mean, is ethics bound up in this book? Ethics is bound up with the fact that in Earth with an A, they still remain close to nature, and in Earth with a U, it's almost a completely kind of urban world.
I wonder, actually. I mean, I'm not entirely sure the answer, but I wonder whether the two things work together. So if you are in touch with the natural world, you may well regard it and yourself and other people differently. If you're not in touch, then maybe it's just a thing to be exploited. There's that. But then I think if you have a society which is deeply ethical, and one of the things they do, so you mentioned earlier that the first title was First Do No Harm, and Ali Smith told me off almost by saying, why did you change the title? It's such a great title, a society where people first of all do no harm. And of course it's because of the medical connotations. You can't have a book that people might think they're buying a medical novel and then they find it's something completely different. And I always knew that would have to change. But if it's a deeply ethical society with a lot of mentoring and a lot of discussing and a lot of coming to consensus, then one of the things they will think about when they're not wanting to do harm is the harm to the environment around them. And again, they've replaced God. There's no God in that Earth at all, but they've replaced God with a deep sense of ethics and a morality, whereas the other planet hasn't.
I mean, they essentially have 3, if not 4, commandments, don't they?
Yes. Yes.
What are they?
Well, if 5, if you count First Do No Harm, which
right,
okay. It comes as chapter headings, as title, headings to the little chapters. Listen with all your heart is the next one. Walk gently, live truth, and love. Yeah. And I thought, I was thinking about these, and I thought, well, if it's a purely secular society, that does seem to cover quite a lot of bases. Do
you have a sense of why Earth with a U has lost any sense of ethical relationships? Because Magnus, Magnus is a hugely he's really good company as a character, because even though he's sort of kind of naive and to a degree and quite open spirited, he's not he's not simple minded.
Right.
But in the end, everyone, the planet might be heating up, but it's quite a cold place.
Emotionally, you mean?
Yes. Yeah. Relationally.
Yes.
Yeah. But do you have an idea what, in your head, did Earth with a U leave something behind at some point, or is it just, I don't know, just the world is different, and in some environments you can't have those kind of ethical considerations.
That's an
because it's too, they're too populous, they're too busy, they're too ages of late capitalism.
Yes, very much so. I think that's an interesting point you raise, and I think it's never too late to have some kind of ethical framework to live by. And I think they've just chosen not to bother. I think they've just chosen that, as you say, late stage capitalism, very extreme capitalism, that it's just every person for themselves, and you get flashes of kindness with this kind of innate kindness in people. You get flashes of it, but it doesn't last, because the imperative is to always look out for yourself, because you don't know who might just take advantage, who might screw you, who might, you might be left on the dung heap somewhere. And I think there's that sense that they've just filled a vacuum by doing away with the concept of God. They filled a vacuum with a lot of things that don't really make a lot of sense.
I mean, this is, just before we came on air, as it were, I was saying that I worry about species fitness to, in terms of coping with the climate challenge, that we are slightly under the impression that if we all pull together, we can make it work. But it doesn't follow, actually, that we can all pull together. That, there might be something about the human being that is, selfish, short-termist, and, wants to, make decisions in the here and now to benefit up, our generation, and that there is something about Earth with a U in this that suggests that might be the case. It might actually be beyond us as human beings.
I really hope it isn't beyond us. But there may be something in that there is this. I mean, the whole. I'm going to talk about Genesis now from the Bible, but the whole business of, and I've talked to some people here already about that. The whole business of the choices that we're given is, are you going to choose ethical choices? Are you going to choose moral? Are you going to choose the way of God, the way of Christ, or are you going to just turn your back on it? That's the whole essence of the Bible, basically. What choices are you going to make? And I think this, without even realizing I'd written this, that I was dealing with these, because I was just writing these stories piecemeal over several years. I guess that what was really in my heart was, what are the choices we make about how we live? And every society has a framework of some kind. But you also see in every society people turning their back on that framework, that moral framework. So I am very concerned about that. Whether we can turn it around, do we have species fitness? We have a choice. But I think a lot of people it's not even not knowing about the choice. I think they don't even think about the choices.
But the conundrum is do we have a choice? It's, you can only, if in 100 years' time, if it all goes wrong, do we basically say everyone made the wrong choice, or in fact that was what human beings were able to do or not do?
I know, I'm partly with you on that, actually, Neil. Do we have a choice? I think there's always a choice. We have free will. We can always make choices about how we treat people. I was talking to somebody very recently about, it may all go absolutely pear-shaped, climate-wise and biodiversity-wise, nature, everything, but we still have a choice to act ethically and morally or not. And it may not, in the end, make a huge difference, especially when we see what's happening in other parts of the world. But it's still the right thing to do. And I remember being at a talk actually years ago by Rowan Williams, the Archbishop, who said, even if we don't succeed, it's the right thing to do. And I do think that's right.
Mm-hmm. So my last quick question before we hear a little bit more from the book is, do you consider this a Christian book, a Christian work of fiction?
I'm not sure I do. I'm not quite sure what it is, actually, to be quite honest.
See, I don't think it is.
No.
I mean, no, at its heart, it is.
Yes.
But if you read it next to explicitly Christian fiction, it would read like a traditionally secular novel.
Yes. I think that's right. I think it would. At its heart, it has all the things I hold dear about my faith. But yes, yeah, it's not like Gilead or something by Marilyn Robertson. It's just there isn't a Christian thing in it, but there's a lot about how we choose to live.
But there's also in the last part, which is which has probably the kind of hope, and it's called love, and has hope in it. Even you don't even push that particularly strongly. I mean, it's not an. I would say it's 25% a kind of ambiguous ending. We don't really know how this how it's going to play out.
That's absolutely right. Yes, and I think it's partly to do with following the character. I think for Magnus to have had a kind of religious epiphany at some point would just not work. It would just because he's so steeped in his home planet's culture.
Yeah,
it just wouldn't happen. So I had to stick with him. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's brilliant. Do you want to read us a little bit more, and then we'll see whether there's some questions?
Yes, happy to. Shall I read that very first story I mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely.
In the workshop. Yeah, okay. So this is called, I've got it from the book now. I did have it on screen, but you'll have to put up with me. These have no meaning at all. And yeah, I'll just read it. These have no meaning at all. Magnus still collects things in his pockets, even though he's 26 and lives on Mars. A rust-coloured rock shaped like a bear, 5 centimeters long and perfect for holding in his gloved hand as he strides across the red dust. 3 smooth, almost perfectly spherical pebbles, which he's had forever. A miniature Earth of royal blue azurite and fern green malachite, streaked with white and grey. The second, of blood red hematite, with wavering lines of black and brown. The last, a nondescript biscuit-coloured sandstone, pitted with tiny holes. The mysterious and flaking imprint of something, a paw print? A promise of life once, or a dream or hope, which he picked up at the side of what could be, from certain angles, a dried-up riverbed, and which he keeps secret for fear of being laughed at. Pliers, dropped by a previous expedition. He should hand these in to the stores, but likes the heft of them in his pocket. String, from a shed on his family farm, a length of woven twine made of hemp. Why he has brought this with him, he is not at all sure. It has no practical use in such a hostile environment, where steel and aluminium are the materials of practicality amid dust storms and solar radiation. A packet of carrot seed, in case it ever begins to rain. And I developed it very slightly from the workshop, but that's basically as it was.
Right, thank you. So let's open it up to questions. Does anyone want to ask Deborah something about this wonderful novella? Sarah's raised her hand.
Hello. I would think characterization is one of the most difficult things to convince readers that you've actually sort of caught a character and presented a character. Have you drawn on people you know, or where do you start with creating the characters that are so compelling as you write?
Oh, interesting question. Yes. Magnus is not anybody I know. He's not anybody I know at all. I do have sons, and I do know how they work a little bit. They'll always be a bit mysterious to me. But I just put him in this situation and just let him make some decisions. That sounds a bit odd, but I think people who write stories will know what I mean, that they sometimes take on a life of their own. And he did. And he surprised me sometimes, really surprised me about what he did and the decisions he made and the things he decided to do. So there are points where I just think, well, a teenage boy is absolutely not going to put up with this. Yeah, and it might be the mentor. It was the mentoring, actually. He's not going to put up with this. He hates it. And so I just let him do and say what he wanted to do and say. So, no, he's not based on anybody I know. It's kind of following a logical conclusion, really, seeing what happens. So I suppose he's part of me.
Thank you.
Alison has raised her hand.
I'm wondering, Deborah, what your most important aim was in writing this, and who do you imagine as your most important audience? Readership.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Alison. That's another interesting question. My aim, I don't think I had an aim, to be quite honest. I started it as a kind of challenge to myself. Could I do this? Because when I started off going to these festivals of flash fiction, I didn't really know much about it. And I went to learn, I went to find out what this was all about. I'd heard about it, didn't know anything. And I was hooked because it's not just tiny stories. They are just brilliantly told. Some of the people who go are real experts in what they do. So it's fantastic just to be chatting to them in the corridor and listening to them talk about their work. So it was a challenge to myself to start to see if I could do it. But then as Magnus became more alive to me as a character, it did take on more of a life of its own. But I don't think I ever really write for anybody else. I write for me. I'm exploring it. I'm the audience, if you like. I'm his audience. So I don't know if that makes any sense.
I think, I mean, it's interesting. I think as a novelist myself, when I'm mentoring young novelists, the thing I say is never, you have to write for yourself or you have to write for the book. If you start double guessing your audience, you'll find no one. And you know, my sense of Earth is that it's got a very wide audience because it has the funnel of a sci-fi sense of it. Planets and spacecraft and suits and landings and all of those things. But actually, that's just a framing device to say something else. But it does feel as though a lot of people are going to fall in love with Magnus, basically.
Oh, thank you.
I think that's the truth of it.
Yes.
But in a way, it has other hooks that maybe stereotypical literary fiction doesn't have. Which will produce its widest readership, I think. Okay, does anyone else have a question? Yeah, George?
Okay, I think my question maybe overlaps a little bit with Alison's question, but maybe is significantly different, so I'm going to ask it anyway. When initially writing the story, did you have in mind a moral which you would wish the reader to consider? And if so, what was that?
The short answer is no. I didn't. I was just exploring the world of Magnus. And I must say, I would love to meet him, actually. I'd love to have a conversation with him. It's quite weird. He's a kind of real person to me. No, I didn't have a moral, but actually there is morality in the book. And yeah, what was rather lovely, we had an in-person launch in Bristol 10 days or so ago, and the bookseller said a really, really lovely thing at the end of the evening, and he said, I feel this book is asking me to be better. And I was bowled over by that, because I didn't have any sense that I was asking anybody to be better or to be different from who they are. I was just writing the story, exploring Magnus's world, and finding out where he would take himself next. and I was just going along for the ride, really. So it was a rather wonderful thing to be said. Thank you. I don't think I can answer that any more fully. Sorry.
I mean, I think there is. I mean, I don't believe that art really should have a message. I have my sort of aesthetic ethics is that art is essentially should be a useless object that somehow does something very profound to us. But there is something in the book about homelessness that I think I sort of understand what Peter at the bookshop is thinking, is that we feel while reading it what it's like to have a kind of profound homelessness. That's what Magnus is going through. And so it's not a moral, but I think we take in from it a feeling that if we thought about it, we would not wish on anyone. And with global migration possibly being the big material factor of climate change that everyone's going to have to deal with, actually having some sense of what that kind of homelessness feels like, I think is not a message or a moral, but you take it out of the book.
That's interesting. Thank you. Yeah, it's the kind of profound homelessness that people have when they cannot return. So I'm thinking about some of the Indian Ocean islands where they will never be, once they leave, they will never be able to return. That's it. Their home is gone forever. And I've been concerned about this for a long time, obviously, because of my interest in climate. And I wrote a novel about 18 years ago, which hasn't been published. I might revive it. I might see whether there's anything any good in it. But there's a whole aspect there of people losing the place where they live. So that's quite a long theme for me. Yeah. And never being able to return.
And that's true for, I mean, that's true for nations that not only, the climate challenge, nations all over the world through, poverty and war and, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, well, hi, Barbara.
Hi, can I just ask a question, Deborah? It's on this flash novel and the way that these little short sections, I'd never come across this before. I'm just wondering, sort of a bit of a technical question here. This is presumably the first book that you've done in this manner?
The only book I've done.
The only book you've done in this manner. Yeah, okay. I mean, it's incredibly effective.
Oh, actually, having said
really
that,
grips one, and just in a few words, you're able to encompass what in another format would probably be a whole 1,000-word chapter. And I'm just wondering, however long did it take you? That sort of wordcraft, you must have really worked on it.
About 4 years. About 4 years, really. So when I sent it off to Neil in 2023, in the summer, July maybe. Summer 2023, and it was my last ditch attempt. He knows this, because I really thought it was unpublishable because of its form, because it is an unusual form. And it wasn't. I'd sent it off to a few sci-fi publishers, and they said, well, it's very nice, but please write us something else. And I thought, well, I'm not really a science fiction writer. I'm not. And so I didn't feel I could conjure something sci-fi up. And then I sent it off to one or two others, and it was probably a little bit too sci-fi for them. And I just thought, well, maybe Weatherglass will like it, but no, hey ho, I'll just send it in, see what happens. And I forgot all about it for about 6 months. And then actually it was December 2023, I heard from Neil that it had been shortlisted. And that absolutely made my day, because I thought, well, it's all been worthwhile. It's great. I didn't expect to get to this point. But yeah, it is So learning from really, really excellent writers has been key, really. I wouldn't have done it without that. I wouldn't have been able to do it.
Thank you.
Okay, so well, look.
Sorry, one last person.
Yeah.
Is Claire there?
All right, sorry, Claire. Yeah.
Hi, Deborah. Sorry, I haven't read your book yet, but I wonder if writing it changed your views about how you think humankind might come together to address climate change, or, you know, all the multiple problems we face. Did it sort of give you, I don't know, creative thoughts about that?
I don't think so, is the short answer. Well, perhaps I did. I think I'd done a lot of thinking when I wrote the Deep Waters program course about what does hope mean, and whether we can find hope within each other, within community. And I still feel that. I still feel that very strongly, that we can find a bit of hope, if not all the hope, but within community. And I think Magnus learns that.
Okay.
But it wasn't a kind of deliberate thing. It just sort of happened.
Thank you.
Well, I will urge you, as to finish, I'll urge you all to read it. I've put the website in the chat room so you can go there directly. In a way, it's, unless you're local to Deborah, it's the only way you're going to get a signed copy by buying it direct from us. And we also make much more money if you buy it direct from us. I think we make about 70p if you buy it from Waterstones, as opposed to about £7 if you buy it direct from us. And we are a tiny, tiny press, so do that if you want, and I will get it signed. But with that, I will. I think that our section is over, so I think we return to George, right?
Thank you very much. I'm just going to close with the grace. But before that, I need to say one thing. I said it to Deborah just before we went live. An adjective I use really far too much is wonderful. But this book is wonderful, literally wonderful. It's full of wonder. I spent the entire time reading it. I finished at about 5 o'clock this morning. And it's just, I was just wondering about Magnus. I was wondering about planets. I was wondering what he was going to do. If you like wondering, read this book. It is a wonderful book. So thank you so much for coming, everyone. It's been a delightful evening. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Neil. Thank you. I'm just going to finish with the grace. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all, now and forevermore. Amen.